Picture having power so complete that you could order armies, construct structures that reach the heavens, and govern millions, yet decide to eradicate all evidence of your presence from the face of the earth. Imagine scribes hammering away at inscriptions in the dead of night, laborious knocking over statues during the darkness, and priests burning holy texts, all to see that human lips would nevermore utter a name. This is not a fantasy book plot. This is the real history of Akhenaten, the pharaoh heretic who reigned for 17 crazy years and then tried to do something new and historic in human annals: destroy his legacy completely. In the golden dunes of ancient Egypt, where immortality was the greatest treasure and remembrance itself was held more dear than gold, one individual made the extreme decision to become a ghost, to change himself from a god-king to a whisper of yesterday. In order to comprehend the enormity of Akhenaten's epochal decision, we need to go back to the pinnacle of the New Kingdom, circa 1353 BCE, when Egypt was the unchallenged gem of the ancient world. The Nile Delta prospered under Amenhotep III, Akhenaten's father, whose 27-year reign had inaugurated prosperity, artistic excellence, and diplomatic victory in the land of the pharaohs. Shining temples to Amun-Ra lined the riverbanks, their gold-encrusted capstones glinting with the early light of dawn as priests conducted the ancient rituals that had nurtured Egyptian civilization for more than 1,000 years. The Theban royal court hummed with envoys from Nubia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant, all paying homage to the pharaoh regarded as the terrestrial manifestation of the deities themselves. Into this life of unchallenged tradition and divine mandate was born Prince Amenhotep IV, the future Akhenaten, whose very life would someday shake every basic assumption that held this ancient civilization intact. The young prince was raised amid the heady incense of temple rituals, the hushed prayers of loyal subjects, and the certain knowledge that he was born to be a living god. Only something deep inside him would resist this foreordained destiny in ways that would rock Egypt to its foundations. When Amenhotep IV came to the throne ca. 1353 BCE, the kingdom looked for another conventional pharaoh to respect the traditional paths and preserve the sublime balance between divine and mundane rule. What they got was something unprecedented, a pervasive revolution that started within the royal palace and reverberated outward like pebbles cast into calm water. Within the early years of his reign, the young pharaoh started granting unparalleled favor to Aten, the sun disk, placing this lesser deity over the powerful Amun-Ra, who had ruled Egyptian theology for centuries. The shift was not just theological, it was intensely personal and gut level. Modern accounts have the pharaoh passing hours in seclusion contemplating, coming out of these times with a fevered look in his eyes, talking of direct revelation from his preferred god. The palace workshops started creating works of art never before seen in Egyptian history. Tall figures with fluid lines, close family moments depicting the pharaoh kissing his wife and daughters, and most shocking of all, truthful representations of the pharaoh's odd physical characteristics: his tall skull, womanly hips, and wide jaw. Where earlier pharaohs had called for idealized perfection in their portrayals, Amenhotep IV demanded radical candor, as though he were getting ready to reveal to the world exactly who he was before he vanished into eternity. In his 4th year in power, Prince Amenhotep IV did something that caused shock waves in the Egyptian establishment. He officially renamed himself Akhenaten, or effective for Aten, legally giving up not only his birth name but also symbolically disavowing the god Amun embedded within it. This was not just a political coup or religious revival. It was the initial step toward what would be the most ambitious bid for self-wiping in the entire history of the ancient world. The newly baptized Akhenaten appeared before his courtiers in the high hall at Thebes, his thin body clad in plain linen instead of the rich ceremonial of old pharaonic robes, and swore that he would worship only one god, Aten, the sun disk whose beams extended to lay hands on the earth. The convened nobles, priests, and officials stood in awed silence as their god-king effectively announced war on 3 millennia of religious heritage, aware that this moment would eternally partition Egyptian history into before and after. But Akhenaten was only getting started. In a matter of months, he had hired architects to build a whole new capital city, several hundred miles north of Thebes, and name it Akhenaten, Horizon of Aten. This was to be both a testament to his new revolutionary religion and, ultimately, the setting for his own deliberately planned vanishing from history. The building of Akhenaten, today's Amarna, was one of the most audacious urban development schemes in history, a shining capital created out of whole cloth in the space of a few years, meant to reflect Akhenaten's revolutionary ideas about divine monarchy and monotheistic worship. Cut into the limestone cliffs that defined the new city, Akhenaten's builders constructed boundary stelae, great stone pillars that declared this territory sacred to Aten and stated that the pharaoh would never depart from here, that he would be buried here with his beloved family. The city itself was a wonder of beauty and innovation. Broad boulevards planted with gardens, temples with open air that lacked the dark inner sanctums of other temples, and the sublime great palace in which Akhenaten sat in judgment under painted ceilings portraying the sun disk casting beneficial rays on the royal household. Perhaps most strikingly, the city was inhabited not just by courtiers and clergy who had accompanied the pharaoh in his religious revolution, but by artists, craftsmen, and common people who had been attracted by the possibility of participating in something radically new to human experience. For close to a decade, Akhenaten flourished as a citadel of artistic creativity and spiritual experimentation, with Akhenaten and his lovely queen Nefertiti being the living epitomes of divine love and harmony. But even as the city was at its peak, dark clouds were collecting on the horizon, in the shape of foreign invasions that were threatening Egypt's empire, and figuratively, because the pharaoh was starting to see that his revolution was collapsing and his own life was going to become a burden to the kingdom that he adored. As Akhenaten's reign went on to enter its second decade, the effects of his revolutionary changes were beginning to manifest themselves in terms that imperiled not just his leadership but the stability of all of the Egyptian empire. News made it to the royal court of temples all across Egypt falling into decay as revenue was redirected into the worship of Aten, of provincial governors having to hold back chaos without the usual religious structure that had kept communities together for generations, and worst of all, of foreign invaders exploiting Egypt's chaos to nibble away at the borders of the empire. The Amarna letters, a group of diplomatic letters unearthed by archaeologists centuries afterward, vividly illustrate vassal kings from Syria to Palestine desperately begging for much-needed military support that never arrived, as Akhenaten persisted in his religious zeal at the expense of his crumbling empire. In Egypt itself, the ancient priestly hierarchy had not been eradicated but had gone underground, secretly preserving the illicit temples of Amun and the other traditional deities and biding their time for their moment to reassert themselves. Palace politics grew more heated as courtiers started to debate whether their pharaoh had forfeited his divine mandate, whether the gods themselves were avenging Egypt for having forsaken the old practices. Even more ominous for Akhenaten as an individual were the indications that even his own family was breaking apart under the strain. Queen Nefertiti vanished from official documents near the 14th year of his reign, perhaps having escaped from the capital or having been removed quietly, and a number of their daughters died young, leaving the pharaoh more and more alone in his lovely but ever hollower city. It was in these darkest months that Akhenaten started to consider the unthinkable, that maybe his greatest contribution to Egypt would be to see to it that his name and memory were wiped clean from history, so that the kingdom could recover without the weight of his failed revolution. The precise moment when Akhenaten decided to engineer his erasure from history is one of the unsolved secrets of ancient Egypt, but it seems that it was a choice made with the same careful deliberation that had governed his religious revolution. In contrast to the other pharaohs who took decades to plan out their grand tombs and memorial complexes, Akhenaten started systematically erasing records of his reign, smelting statues, chiseling his name from official documents, and most strikingly, having his scribes compile bogus genealogies that would link his eventual successor directly to his father Amenhotep III, essentially glossing over his entire 17-year reign. The pharaoh who had once vowed that he would never abandon his beloved Akhenaten was secretly making preparations for the city's abandonment, moving crucial staff back to Thebes and Memphis secretly while keeping up appearances of normal court life. Modern reports from anxious courtiers tell of a pharaoh becoming visibly gaunt and withdrawn, spending hours gazing out at the Nile from his palace windows as if preparing to take a trip from which he would never return. Perhaps most ominously, Akhenaten started referring to himself in the third person when speaking in private as if he were already dead, already metamorphosed into the ghost he would soon become. The handful of trusted counselors who stood by him recognized they were seeing something new in the annals of human history, a man with unchallenged authority deciding to exercise that authority to annihilate himself, to be a bad example that would never be spoken of because no one would recall that it ever existed. The systematic removal of Akhenaten from Egyptian history began even before his death and went on with ruthless efficiency for decades afterwards, being perhaps the most successful attempt at damnatio memoriae ever attempted in the ancient world. Operating in the dead of night, squads of master craftsmen worked their way through Akhenaten and temples across Egypt, methodically carving out cartouches with Akhenaten's name, defacing facial features on statues, and incinerating papyrus scrolls that had mentions of his rule. The destruction was so complete that subsequent generations of Egyptians would only mention Akhenaten by the name the criminal of Akhenaten, or that rebel when compelled to admit to his existence at all. Still more astoundingly, the erasure went beyond simple physical destruction. Official lists of kings made up by subsequent pharaohs simply leaped from Amenhotep III to Tutankhamun, as if the 17 years Akhenaten held the throne had never passed. The resplendent city of Akhenaten was left so utterly deserted that Dunes later covered its palaces and temples, turning the great former capital into a whispered rumor that few people accepted and fewer cared to explore. Royal painters who had spent years mastering the characteristic el-Amarna style suddenly found themselves working in the traditional Egyptian style, as if the innovative phase had been a communal dream. Perhaps most tragically, even Akhenaten's burial was left incomplete and unmarked, his mummy never properly prepared for the afterlife that Egyptians deemed a prerequisite for eternal life, the ultimate sacrifice of a man who had sacrificed historical remembrance for divine immortality. More than 3 millennia passed before Akhenaten's scheme prospered almost to perfection. His name was forgotten, his capital was lost, and his revolution was reduced to a minor blip in the archaeological record that few scholars could describe or even identify. It was not until the late 19th century that European archaeologists began uncovering strange artifacts at a site called el-Amarna, finding artistic styles and religious iconography that seemed completely alien to everything they knew about ancient Egyptian culture. The breakthrough was achieved when philologists were able to decipher the Amarna letters, not just uncovering the existence of a lost pharaoh but also the range of his revolutionary religious reforms and the deliberate historical erasure. As digs proceeded into the 20th and 21st centuries, an amazing image developed of a revolution that had shaken civilization but left such a deep impression as to be all but forgotten, even to ancient Egyptian historians. The irony was unavoidable. Akhenaten's efforts to erase himself from history were so successful that his discovery was one of the triumphs of archaeology, making him more well-known in death than he had been alive. Today, museums everywhere show the eerie beauty of Amarna art, its intense royal portraits and revolutionary religious iconography, a testament to a pharaoh whose greatest success was meant to be his disappearance. The man who had attempted to achieve ghosthood had become more alive and more compelling to the audiences of today than many pharaohs whose names had never been lost, and perhaps the best way to guarantee immortality is to try its opposite. Akhenaten's tale is one of the greatest in history's contemplation of legacy, memory, and the dynamics between power and longevity. Here was a guy who had everything that ancient monarchs could ever have fantasized about: complete domination, divine right, and wealth to construct monuments that would endure for millennia, and proceeded to dedicate these gifts to his erasure. His story compels us to consider embarrassing questions regarding the nature of historical memory. How many other individuals have been successfully eliminated from the record? What truths are lost to us forever because a person had both the power and the will to erase them? In our contemporary era of digital immortality and incessant documentation, Akhenaten's tale is a near impossibility to grasp, but it speaks powerfully to modern uncertainties regarding identity, authenticity, and the impulse to flee from the burden of one's past. Perhaps most astonishingly, his failure to erase himself has made him more interesting than any traditional pharaonic legacy might have done. We are captivated by his humanity, his uncertainty, his willingness to give up everything, even his immortality, for what he thought was a greater good. The Pharaoh who attempted to erase himself from history has instead shown us that the greatest stories are frequently the ones that somebody attempted in vain to keep from being told. The secrets of ancient Egypt still yield themselves year by year, and Akhenaten's tale served to remind us that history is more intricate and full of surprises than we tend to imagine. If you enjoyed this story of the self-erasing Pharaoh as much as I did, be sure to subscribe to our channel and push that notification bell. We're always finding more lost stories from the ancient world that will blow your mind and change everything you think you know about the past. In the discussion board below, write and tell me what part of Akhenaten's tale most interested you. Was it his radical religious upending, his methodical attempt at erasing himself from history, or the irony of his rediscovery today? And if you're starved for even more archaeological enigmas, then watch our video on the vanished tomb of Alexander the Great or our investigation into the Antithetical mechanism. There's more ancient history with tales stranger than fiction, and we're just beginning to dig them up together.